Hello again, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Wednesday the 10th of May. I'm Andrew Wilson, and this is Scotland at 7. This evening I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 441 of the illegal Russian war of aggression. Then I will introduce our guest for this evening, and then together we will take a look at today's headlines from Scotland and around the world. The French Parliament has called on the EU to formally label the Russian mercenary group Wagner as terrorists, as the UK reportedly prepares to do the same. France's Parliament unanimously passed a non-binding resolution aimed at encouraging the 27 members of the EU to put Wagner on its official list of terrorist organisations. After 2 months of building a legal case, prescription or a formal blacklisting of the group was imminent and likely to be enacted within weeks, according to a UK government source. Ukraine's state-owned Energoatom company said today that it had received information about preparations for the evacuation of about 3,100 people from the southern city of Enerhodar. That's the town that serves the occupied Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, and that includes 2,700 workers who had signed contracts with the Russian-installed company and resulting in a catastrophic lack of personnel. Ukraine has repeatedly criticized Russia for forcibly deporting its citizens from occupied Ukrainian regions into Russian Federation territory. Russia may formally denounce the Treaty on Conventional Armed Forces in Europe that it pulled out of in 2015. That's according to a decree signed by President Vladimir Putin today. The decree formally appoints Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov to represent Putin during parliamentary proceedings on denouncing the treaty, which aimed to regulate the number of forces deployed by the Warsaw Pact and NATO countries. Russia announced in 2015 that it was completely halting its participation in the treaty, having already suspended cooperation in 2007. Russia argues that the treaty, which was intended to balance conventional forces towards the end of the Cold War, was de facto in breach because former Soviet republics and Warsaw Pact nations had become members of NATO by the early 2000s. The governor of Russia's Voronezh region said today that 2 drones attempted to attack a military facility in his region, but they failed. TASS reports that the Russian Federation Security Service, the FSB, has claimed to have prevented an assassination attempt on a police chief in the occupied Zaporizhia region. The Secretary-General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, has spoken in Brussels at a meeting of NATO's military committee. He said the alliance needs to redouble our efforts in order to provide security to the 1 billion people in NATO countries, citing what he claimed was a range of rising threats. Armand Soldin, a 32-year-old video journalist for Agence France-Presse in Ukraine, was killed by a Grad rocket fire near Chasiv Yar in eastern Ukraine, AFP said on Twitter, citing AFP colleagues who witnessed the incident. The UK Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, and the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, have urged Russia not to use hunger as a weapon of war as discussions over the Black Sea grain deal continue. And Ukraine said its air defences shot down 23 of 25 missiles fired overnight on Monday by Russia, chiefly at Kyiv, and there were no reported casualties. It was the second night in a row of major Russian airstrikes and the 5th so far in May. Now, we are lucky enough to be joined this evening by Professor John W. Robertson. John is a retired professor of media politics. He provides not-for-profit independent political analysis, and he is now one of our leading citizen journalists, writing most regularly on the blog, which you can find at Talking Up Scotland too. John, good evening. It's been a while since you and I have spoken. How are you keeping?
Good evening. I'm as well as I can be. Hope you are too.
Indeed. I'm glad to hear it, and it's great to see you. Thank you for joining us on Broadcasting Scotland this evening, John. Our first story is that speaking in the House of Lords today, Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, has condemned the UK government's illegal migration bill, stating that it is morally unacceptable and politically impractical to let the poorest countries deal with the crisis alone and cut our international aid. The bill, which aims to remove the incentive to make small boat crossings over the Channel, to speed up the removal of so-called illegal immigrants, and to prevent people who come to the UK through illegal or dangerous journeys by blocking the removal and resettle a specific number of those who the government sees as the most vulnerable refugees in the UK itself. The bill has already faced criticism from a number of organisations and public figures, including the UK representative at the UN High Commission for Refugees, Vicky Tennant, an independent membership organisation Liberty, the Archbishop of York, Stephen Cottrell, Rabbi Jonathan Wittenberg, who's the senior rabbi of Masorti, traditional Judaism in the UK, and Rabbi Charlie Baginski, the chief executive of Liberal Judaism. In his speech today, the Archbishop also stated that existing global conventions and agreements are not inconvenient obstructions to be got around by any legislative means necessary. And he reiterated the UNHCR's warning that the bill could lead to the collapse of the international system that protects refugees. He finished by urging the government to reconsider the bill, which he said fails to live up to our history, our moral responsibility, and our political and international interests. Responding to the Archbishop, Robert Jenrick, the Immigration Minister, has said that Justin Welby was wrong on both counts when he called it morally unacceptable and politically impractical. Speaking to the World at One, Robert Jenrick said, "Firstly, there's nothing moral about allowing the pernicious trade of people smugglers to continue. I disagree with him respectfully. By bringing forward this proposal, we make it clear that if you come across illegally on a small boat, you will not find a route to life in the UK. That will have a serious deterrent effect." So the Archbishop of Canterbury enjoyed top billing at the coronation on Saturday as Master of Ceremonies and Chief Putter-on and Tweaker of Crowns. And then this afternoon, just days later, he's back in the spotlight. Yes, he's always spoken out on this issue, but this pretty visceral attack on one of the government's top 5 supposed priorities has perhaps added piquancy because it comes just 5 days after he took such a prominent role at the coronation. So, as I mentioned, the Archbishop said the bill is isolationist, it is morally unacceptable and politically impractical to let the poorest countries deal with this alone and cut our international aid. But John, surely those are the very cornerstones of Tory government policy since 2016, if not before. Isolationism, immorality, and undeliverable political promises.
Well, exactly. It's a very rare occurrence for me to find myself agreeing with the Archbishop of Canterbury. In fact, it's a first, probably. This tells you a great deal about how far to the right, how close to the early stages, the foothills of fascism this Conservative government is now travelling, when the Archbishop of Canterbury and the King are unhappy with their behaviour. It's quite disturbing, really, that that's the case. But it's not going to hold them back because they have an element within the party, and I think in their electorate, and probably sadly in the electorate of the Labour Party, a population willing to support them in these extreme views. It's a very sad situation. I don't see it getting better in the short term.
Thanks, John. And it's opposite that you mentioned the short term, because in his first intervention during a House of Lords debate on the bill, the Archbishop said it did not address the 2 key causes of international migration: climate crisis and war. And so I wonder, does that perhaps expose another undeniable truth about Tory government policies? They look no further than the very next news cycle. There's no perspective, there's no vision, there's no future.
I think that's a problem with politicians generally, is a kind of narrow, short-termist sort of view of things. It's understandable, of course, they're worried about their immediate future, their survival in the short term of 4 to 5 years. But as you've pointed out, what's happening here with the movement of people globally is a consequence of increased poverty and of conflict, and some of it, of course, is even longer term. It's to do with empires. It's to do with imperial powers such as Britain arriving in other parts of the world, like India, and causing movement of population. But then when they withdraw, causing a kind of a suction that pulls populations towards them as people see opportunities. It's history tells us it will not be stopped. There has been no population movement, mass population movement historically that has, to my knowledge anyway, there may be exceptions, that has been stopped. It's a matter of time. And, Britain will have to accept it, just as the Germans have accepted it. And the Germans took in more than a million. And now their economy is booming with that supply of young labour.
It's a very good point, John. If I can think of an example of a mass migration that was stopped, I'll let you know, but I can't think of one either at the moment. Not if I can think of one, I'll let you know, but I can't think of one either. I think you're absolutely right. Thanks, John. Now, we'll move on to our next item now, because this morning the UK government was set to scrap basic workers' rights by sunsetting an EU law that prevents employers from forcing staff to work more than 48 hours a week. The EU Working Time Directive ensured that employers kept records to prove employees had not worked more than 48 hours in a week. The regulations also enshrined in law the right to be paid time off and rest breaks, with employers mandated to provide at least 20 minutes uninterrupted breaks. This follows the government's introduction of the EU Retained Law Bill, which is intended to scrap many EU-implemented employment rights. Commenting this morning on the bill and the decision to sunset the directive, the SNP MP Chris Stevens said that the Working Time Directive is essential to ensure that workers are not forced by their employer to work overtime without being paid for it. It also protects our rights to paid holidays and breaks, but that would be ripped up by the Tories due to their Brexit obsession. He added, "It feels like there is no basic human right that is not under threat from this Tory government." However, that's not the whole story. This afternoon it became clear that the British government no longer intends to remove all European laws by the end of this year, and that was a flagship policy for hardline Brexiteers that had already sparked warnings from business and the opposition about legal uncertainty and bureaucratic chaos. The government said it would amend legislation currently making its way through Parliament to propose revoking by the end of 2023 only around 600 of the something like 4,000 EU laws remaining since Britain left the bloc in 2020. The bill had aimed to automatically remove any remaining EU laws at the end of this year unless they were explicitly chosen to be saved. And the Prime Minister's spokesperson said in January that the government would not change that deadline. However, today the government is tabling an amendment which will replace the current sunset in the bill with a list of the retained EU laws that we intend to revoke under the bill at the end of 2023, according to the Business and Trade Minister, Kimi Badenoch, who provided a written statement to Parliament today. This provides certainty for business by making it clear which regulations will be removed from our statute book, instead of highlighting only the retained EU law that would be saved. Badenoch claims that 1,000 EU laws have already been revoked or reformed since Britain left the EU, and a further 500 would be revoked by two other bills which are also in process of making their way through Parliament. But Jacob Rees-Mogg, amongst other things a hardline Brexiteer and the business minister at the time the bill was introduced, expressed his disappointment. "Regrettably, the Prime Minister has shredded his own promise rather than EU laws," he tweeted. Opposition politicians have been warning the revocation of EU law would create massive amounts of work for departments with little benefit, empower ministers to replace laws as they see fit, and open the door to weaker regulatory protections. Almost half of British directors would prefer to retain laws inherited from the EU instead of seeing the government remove them, an Institute of Directors survey published earlier this month has found. So, John, the Business and Trade Secretary Kimi Badenoch made her case for the change in direction in a piece in the Telegraph. She said that getting rid of EU law in the UK should be about more than a race to a deadline. She said it should be about making sure our laws work for the people who use them. She also said that Whitehall had been focusing on the laws that should be preserved ahead of the deadline rather than pursuing the meaningful reform government and businesses want to see. So, notwithstanding her written statement to the House and what she told the Telegraph this afternoon, are the events of today simply more evidence, if more evidence was needed, that Brexiteers never ever had any plan what they would do if they won the referendum, and that they had no idea what would actually be involved?
I think the leading Brexiteers did have an idea. It wasn't a detailed idea by any means. They had an idea that they'd be free to do what they liked, and they're starting to do what they liked. Um, it's I mean a massive loss of workers' rights here, and being carried out by a party which was elected in large part by working people who were deluded enough to think that somehow this party, this right wing Conservative Party, would protect them against enemies they don't really have, such as the EU or the French or some other kind of mythical threat to their lives. The real threat to their lives, of course, is the very party they've voted for. And I mentioned earlier this drift to the right, this drift towards the foothills of fascism. The captains of industry are not with them in the main. They've moved to the right of the captains of industry. They've moved to the right of the corporations, because the corporations and the senior members of employer groups, they know that these changes will actually make it more difficult to actually work with their employees.
Thanks, John. And that's a good point that you make. We know that in comparative terms, productivity in the UK is at the very bottom of Western Europe. So do you think in what way do you think the government feels that sunsetting the EU Working Time Directive would improve productivity rather than damage it?
Yeah, I think we know. I mean, I can't quote the research, but I think we know that productivity is high where workers are treated with respect, where there's a constructive relationship between management and between workers. When you see that in countries like Germany, countries which are very successful manufacturers, they haven't done that by beating down their workers and enriching the top executives. They've got a much narrower gap than we have between the average worker and the members of the board. It's all wrong, as well as being kind of malicious and really quite disgusting. Really, it's wrong. It doesn't work.
Absolutely. Thanks, John. We'll move on now and look at Brexit from a slightly different perspective, because according to the British Retail Consortium, new Brexit fees on goods coming into Britain from the EU will add hundreds of pounds to the cost of importing each lorry load of produce, while added red tape from October, could see a fresh wave of disruption at ports and more shortages of goods on supermarket shelves, which may in turn cause food prices to rise even further. Shoppers face a decline in choice in supermarkets because of these new Brexit fees. And there are worries that a new system will lead to more shortages in supermarkets, similar to the lack of fruit and vegetables that hit UK stores and led to rationing earlier this year. The government plans to phase in checks under its border target operating model from October. This is when health certification on imports of some animal, plant, and food products is set to begin, with more checks then introduced in January and October 2024. Nick Allen, who's the chief executive of the British Meat Processors Association, stated that some products would fall by the wayside as firms grapple with the new requirements. He suggested that some companies will have to change their business models to survive. Andrew Opie, the Director of Food and Sustainability at the British Retail Consortium, said that the system needed to work smoothly from day one to cut the risk of shortages on supermarket shelves. In the autumn, we increase imports of fresh produce from Europe that has a short shelf life, so it is imperative the system works well from day one to avoid an impact on customers, he said. Commenting on the possible price rises, the SNP's EU accession spokesperson Alan Smith MP said the UK has, remarkably, essentially not policed imports arriving from the EU, so the custom checks that have caused such disruption already have essentially only been on exports. But with these new import checks being introduced in a matter of weeks, I'm terrified at what it will do to an already overstretched food supply chain. So, John, Andrew Opie of the British Retail Consortium also said that the extra costs are always an issue when we are tackling inflation. But he warned that the main impact of checks would also be on availability of goods if there's disruption at the ports. So looking at the first part of what he said, extra costs are always an issue when we're tackling inflation. How is the Bank of England going to bring inflation down if the Tory Brexit is busy pushing prices up?
Well, it's impossible. I mean, I'm sure that's what you were getting at there. It's utterly impossible for the Bank of England to do anything about that. We were promised cheaper food. Um, everybody was well, everybody in the campaign to leave the EU was promising cheaper food, and the mainstream media failed entirely to report the research and the opinion that countered that. I mean, there were many people who were suspicious about that whole idea. We thought, how can you leave? How can you leave a major organisation like that, which specialises in the production of food and the transport of that food, and expect things to be somehow better? It's just inevitable. I think it was kind of obvious things were going to be worse. And this is another major catastrophe that the working people have voted for because they were lied to. They were lied to by the politicians, and they were, I suppose, failed or betrayed by the mainstream media.
That's a good way of looking at it. And just, John, just to briefly tease out this a little bit more, as well as the new checks starting in October, physical checks on agricultural food imports are set to begin in January 2024, and that's before further safety and security declarations for all imports from Europe come into force in October 2024. So do you think, is there a prospect that we're going to be seeing yet more recipes for neeps in our diet as 2024 comes around? And what do you think the impact of increased delays on top of increased costs is going to be on our diet?
I think we're on a downward slope here, a worsening situation, which will result in real hardship. Already has resulted in real hardship for people who are struggling with the cost of food. That will get worse. I think history tells us that before things get better and before the electorate will turn and understand really what they have done, I think it has to get very bad. I'd be very surprised if in 10 years' time we're not negotiating re-entry to the EU. But that will have to be, I think, after a period of even greater suffering and inconvenience is too soft a word for it.
Thanks, John. I'm reminded of one of those inspirational posters that you used to see in the 90s, which said, "It's always darkest just before it gets really, really dark."
Yeah.
But the point you're making is absolutely right, and I think the demographics round about support for membership of the EU are
Yes,
going to begin to impact
because yeah,
as time goes
because
on.
yeah, because no matter what Labour say, I mean, no matter what Labour say, this cannot be managed. Labour is convinced that it would be electric to campaign for re-entry. They will eventually, of course, come around to it, I think. So at the moment, they're offering this middle way. It reminds me a bit of Tony Blair. This middle way between EU membership and non-EU membership, that somehow will have this healthy relationship. That this major trading bloc will do us lots of favours to enable us to thrive in the way that the way that Ireland is thriving, of course, right inside the EU. That's not going
Yes.
to happen. The Labour will come to power, hung Parliament with the Lib Dems, probably in a coalition, and very quickly people will see that they can't do either.
That's a good point that you make, John, given the reporting today of the plans in Ireland to establish a sovereign wealth fund, given the budget surpluses which the Irish government has started running. But I'm sure we'll come back to that story as it begins to unfold. But we'll come back to Scotland for our next item, because ahead of the All Energy Summit in Glasgow today, the SNP highlighted 6 times that the Westminster system has failed Scotland's vital energy sector. Those failures include failing to include the Acorn project in Track 1 of carbon capture funding, failing to guarantee that Acorn will be part of Track 2 funding, heaping further uncertainty on the industry, dropping the £1 billion grant to develop carbon capture technology, failing to match the Scottish Government's £500 million Just Transition Fund, failing to tackle extremely high transmission charges, and prioritising nuclear over Scotland's vast renewable energy resources. The SNP has challenged the UK government to hand Holyrood control over energy so that the industry can receive the support it needs to reap the opportunities of the just transition. Commenting on this, the SNP's Net Zero and Energy Security spokesperson, Alan Brown MP, said that for decades Westminster has been utterly failing Scotland's energy sector, and it's the people of Scotland who are paying for that serious failure, adding that Westminster is also letting down the workers by refusing to match the SNP government's significant £500 million investment in the just transition to ensure that there are jobs in the energy sector for generations to come. So, John, already this evening we've spoken a couple of times about voters and what voters have been persuaded to vote for. With regard to energy policy, do you think voters are starting to get it? It's been argued that energy-rich Scotland has bankrolled London for the last 30 or 40 years, and now it looks likely that they plan to continue with that heist. So if voters don't get it at the moment, why don't they get it, and will they get it?
I think you're right. They haven't got it yet. I mean, but a significant proportion of the population, I suppose, has got it. The high 40% that is solidly behind independence, presumably they've got it. But a lot of the others clearly haven't got it. And it's the same explanation, I think, for so much of the misunderstandings that people share. And that's the media coverage. I mean, the media coverage has been very careful. They can't entirely conceal Scotland's enormous energy production wealth here, but they have trimmed it. They've kind of softened it in some ways by qualifying it all the time. I'm quite surprised by those 6 points that the SNP have raised there. I mean, I agree with some of them more than others. I'm going to break ranks a bit here. The first three are about carbon capture. Really surprised that those are the first three. Carbon capture is I know it's had a lot of publicity here in the sense of betrayal here, but there's a lot of doubt about carbon capture. And I'm not an environmentalist, I'm not a scientist, but I've read some quite negative stuff about carbon capture. It's very, very expensive. There's massive costs in actually setting up the infrastructure. It's unknown what the long-term consequences will be of that kind of storage, and it's a lot of additional expense. The other 3 points, I agree with the one about the transition. I think there should be much more investment by the UK government in the transition from the carbon industry to the renewables. But the other two are far more important. I think the fifth one strikes me as by far the most important. It's the one that I've tried to give a lot of attention to in my blog, and other social media people have as well. And that's the business of the transmission charges. That it costs more to put Scottish Power on the system than it does to put power on in England. Or somewhere around London, it's very cheap. If you were able to generate renewable power there, electricity around London, it costs you far less than it does to put it online up in the north of Scotland. And that's an inhibiting factor, and it's inhibiting one of the richest and one of the highest potential energy production sectors in the world. I mean, Scotland has enormous potential there, and those costs. Then the final one you mentioned, of course, was the nuclear transmission one. I mean, the media coverage here is appalling. You never hear about nuclear power. You never hear that about half of France's nuclear power stations are down at any one time. Half of them are struggling with rust problems. You never hear about the hundreds and hundreds of security alerts in the UK's nuclear facilities, where people without proper identification have managed to get on site. The risk from terrorism in the nuclear industry is quite high, not being dealt with. So, well, I'm glad the SNP has raised this, but I think they've kind of missed the point a wee bit with this fuss about carbon capture.
Thanks, John. That's a very good point. I was just trying to check to see if the two nuclear power stations in Scotland were online or not at the moment, because they were offline for some considerable time. I can't see the information. If I can find out, I'll bring it back in. But I knew that in particular you would anticipate the point with regard to the high transmission charges. So I'm very
Yeah,
grateful to you for your thoughts on that in particular.
I feel
Thank you.
I feel sure Hunterston B is down. I don't know about the other one, but I think Hunterston B is definitely down at the moment, and they have no future. I mean, they didn't. The X-ray photography in Hunterston B found several hundred cracks.
Absolutely. Thanks, John. Now, we're lucky to have John this evening because we're particularly lucky to have John with us this evening because the next item is that it has been alleged at the High Court today that Piers Morgan knew about illegal phone hacking when he was editor of the Daily Mirror. The first day of the phone hacking trial brought by Prince Harry and other well-known figures against Mirror Group newspapers heard claims that illegal activity, including voicemail interception, was carried out on an industrial scale by staff at Mirror newspapers. David Sherborne, the barrister acting for the alleged victims, told the court that Morgan must have known about illegal behaviour at the newspaper he edited between 1995 and 2004. In one alleged incident, Morgan asked a journalist to name the source of a celebrity story and was told the information has come from voicemails. In another, a witness described how Morgan was laughing mockingly as he entertained the entire newsroom by repeatedly playing staff a private voicemail left by Paul McCartney for his then girlfriend Heather Mills. A witness also claims that Morgan knew the default PIN codes that could be used to illegally access voicemails on different mobile phone networks. The former Daily Mirror political editor David Seymour told the court that staff at the newspaper had heard Morgan openly discussing how phone hacking operated when at dinner with executives. Having worked closely with the editor for a decade, he alleged that Morgan was unreliable and boastful and apt to tell untruths when it suited him. Benjamin Wegg-Prosser, a former Downing Street official, recalled going for dinner at a Chinese restaurant with Morgan during the Labour Party conference in September 2002. During the meal, Wegg-Prosser asked Morgan how the Daily Mirror had obtained a story about an affair between the England football manager Sven-Göran Eriksson and the television presenter Ulrika Jonsson. The legal filings say that Mr. Morgan asked Mr. Prosser which network provider he used for his mobile phone and then told him the default PIN number for that network, and then explained that the default PIN numbers were well known and rarely changed, which is how mobile phone messages could be accessed remotely. He then said with a smile that the story on Mr. Eriksson and Ms. Jonsson was obtained through that method. The journalist Omid Scobie also heard that Morgan discussing the use of voicemails when he was a student during work experience on the Mirror's entertainment desk in 2002. Morgan, now a presenter on Rupert Murdoch's Talk TV, has always denied knowingly commissioning or publishing stories based on illegally obtained voicemails. Mirror Group Newspapers has accepted that phone hacking took place at its titles and has already paid out more than £100 million in settlements and legal costs. It is fighting this trial on the basis that many of the claims were allegedly brought too late. So, John, I'm sorry to be talking about Piers Morgan, but do you think, does this, thinking about the media more generally for a moment, does this case perhaps explain Morgan's demented, frothing antipathy towards Prince Harry? Because Morgan knows, who's a claimant in this case, because Morgan knows that the Prince's lawyers and other lawyers can show that Morgan targeted the Prince when he was a young man and broke the law doing it.
I'm sure that's perfectly correct. That's the case. But although there's more to it with Morgan. I mean, Morgan, like Donald Trump, like Jeremy Clarkson, like many other media personalities we sometimes see on a regular basis, and like one or two leading lights in the Conservative Party, Morgan is, I think I can say this, is a creep. They're all creeps. They're the kind of people, if you'd been at school with them, you would know them well, and you would despise them for the kind of immorality of their treatment of other people. This is just more evidence to my mind. You at the beginning of the show, you referred to me as a citizen journalist, and it's a term I would use about myself. I know some professional journalists would poo-poo the idea that I can be a journalist because I'm not trained and I haven't worked for a newspaper. But my view is that that's been a lucky escape. If you work for a newspaper, you're working for a corporation. You're working for a for-profit corporation. Your task is to make profit. And so you end up at the extreme end, I appreciate, with people like Piers Morgan and papers like the Mirror and the Mail and so on. But there are some good journalists. There are some, very few, there are some who are tolerated. Major corporations, even newspapers like The Guardian, has to make a profit, has to get some kind of income. It will only tolerate a small number of these saintly figures, who investigate and speak fearlessly. There are one or two, but the whole system is flawed, and state-funded journalism is no better. We see that globally. The state-funded journalism cannot be trusted. So, for all I'll finish on this. For all the criticisms social media has within it, much of the worst I appreciate, but it also has much of the best in journalism.
That's a very good way of looking at it. Thanks, John. And just to finished our review of the media landscape. As we know, earlier this month, Rupert Murdoch settled the defamation action from Dominion in the US, and at the same time, Tucker Carlson, the lead anchor on Fox News in the US, abruptly left the station. So, do you think, given that Morgan is now working for Murdoch on Talk TV, do you think that Murdoch will drop Morgan from his Talk TV slot, or do you think Morgan's likely to cut and run first?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't have any kind of inside information, that kind of thing. And in many respects, because as I pointed out already, they're all creeps. I'm not really going to be that much interested in them. I've been watching the Succession series, and that's pretty much correct, I think, in its assessment of people like Murdoch and Maxwell and all the others. Um, I, you know, I probably don't care actually. I just wish they would die.
Well, it's what we will do actually, and you anticipated this. What we'll do now is we will segue from Piers Morgan to Donald Trump, because a jury has found that Donald Trump sexually abused E. Jean Carroll in the civil trial over her allegation that he raped her in a New York department store in 1996. E. Jean Carroll told NBC that she was overwhelmed with joy and happiness and delight for the women of this country a day after the verdict was handed down in Manhattan. Former US President Donald Trump was also found to have defamed Carroll, if not to have raped her, and was ordered to pay around $5 million in damages. Carroll said, "I didn't even hear the money. This is not about the money. This is about getting my name back, and that's what we have accomplished." In court, under cross-examination, Carroll explained why she did not report the assault at the time, instead swearing friends to secrecy and trying to cope for years with the devastating effect on her life. Regarding the Access Hollywood tape, which emerged in 2016, and in which Trump can be heard bragging about grabbing women, Trump was asked, "Is it true that you can grab them by the pussy?" He said, "Well, if you look over the last million years, I guess that's been largely true. Not always, but largely true. Unfortunately, or fortunately." Fortunately? Appearing on NBC with E. Jean Carroll, Roberta Kaplan, her lawyer, said that the jury saw on our side 11 witnesses who took the stand day after day, including E. Jean, for more than 2 days, under oath and told the truth. On the other hand, Trump didn't even bother to show up, and in his deposition he made admissions where he was basically a witness against himself. Kaplan also said she was sure she would be able to collect the $5 million in damages from Trump. E. Jean Carroll also discussed her conversation with Joe Tacopina, Trump's lawyer at the end of the trial, stating that he approached her to congratulate her and that as he held out his hand, she said, "He did it and you know it," after which they shook hands and passed each other by. Outside court, Tacopina said, "I know some people in Trump's camp are very happy that the rape claim was rejected," adding, "I'm not happy that he was found liable for anything." He also stated that there were plenty of reasons to appeal. Donald Trump is set to appear on a CNN town hall in New Hampshire this evening, and it is likely that he will face questions about being found liable for sexual abuse and defamation. So, John, I apologise for the previous item, and I apologise for segueing from Piers Morgan to Donald Trump. But do you think, does this finding in a civil court in Manhattan, does it make Trump less electable because now only his hardcore base will vote for him, and he cannot win a US election with only his base supporting him?
Yeah, I think that's fair. I don't think even the Republicans now will select him as their candidate. I think he's surprisingly still popular, I guess, and there are still people who are crazy enough to go out there on the streets and try and fight for him in some way, sometimes physically. But I think this has taken him one step too far. I think the Republicans will find another candidate, maybe the man from Florida. I've forgotten his name. Seems a likely candidate. But I think again, I think the Democrats are on a surefire win if they stick with Biden. If Biden survives long enough to do so, then I think it's a walkover next time.
That's a good point, John. Thank you. And how foolish do you think are Murdo Fraser and other Scottish Tories who lauded Trump just a couple of weeks ago feeling now? Or do they just not care? I could see Janie Godley reminding Murdo of what he'd said on Twitter this morning.
How foolish do I think Murdo Fraser is? There's a question. I'll have to think. I'm reminded of a comedian trying to describe the national debt, and he was using pushing his hand up in the air and says this high and so on, until eventually he was talking about the national debt of the US, and he just screamed for an indication of what the number was. It wasn't a number; it was a scream. I can't remember which comedian it was, but I think the same would be true of the lack of intelligence of some of the leading Scottish Conservatives in their ability to judge someone like Donald Trump as in any way credible. I mean, I wouldn't have believed this 50 years ago that this could happen. I know that a lot of it was kept under wraps. Politicians did behave badly in the past, but this seems unbelievable. Couldn't write it.
Absolutely, John. You couldn't write it. But that's enough about Piers Morgan and Donald Trump. Let's move to our next item now. Police have appealed to the public to help name 22 murdered women in the Netherlands, Belgium, and Germany whose bodies have never been identified, some of whom died more than half a century ago. The International Policing Organization has published details of the cold cases that would normally only be available to other law enforcement agencies in a campaign they have named Operation Identify Me. Carina van Leeuwen and Martin de Wit of the Dutch police, whose efforts to identify a woman found in a bin in a river in 1999 led to the campaign, and they said that most of these 22 victims died violently, and some were also abused or starved before they died. Partly because the women are likely from countries other than where they were found, their identities have not yet been established. It is possible that their bodies were left in our countries to impede criminal investigations. Anja Allendorf of the German police said that establishing the victim's ID could ultimately lead to the arrest of a suspect. Most of these women were aged between 15 and 30 at the time of their deaths, police estimate, and some may have come from Central and Eastern Europe. Their bodies were found between 1976 and 2019. The Dutch police provided details of 9 cold cases, Belgian police 7, and the German police 6 cold cases. The Interpol web pages include facial reconstructions of some of the murdered women, as well as videos and pictures of recognisable items such as jewellery and clothing discovered at the sites where their bodies were dumped. Other details include the woman's estimated age, their hair and eye colour, and other key physical characteristics. Susan Hitchen of Interpol's DNA unit said that this was the first time information from so-called black notices had been made public. Black notices are used to seek intelligence on unidentified bodies and to determine the circumstances of the death. They contain details of the scene, the victim's appearance and clothing, and other relevant observations, and are usually restricted to police. Hitchens said that she hoped the operation would prompt members of the public to contact police and allow families to grieve and move forward. She said new information could ultimately allow police to provide the identity to these victims and ideally help lead to the perpetrator, if there is one. The information on the woman can be found on the Interpol website on the Operation Identify Me pages. So, John, I think this is the saddest, most horrible story that I've read in some considerable time. Each of the individual cases on the Interpol website is heartbreaking, and it struck me it's a bit like the script of the 2014 drama The Missing, which starred Jimmy Nesbitt and Ken Stott, but is much, much worse. So what do you think it says about policing in Europe that it's taken until now for this coordinated cross-border public approach to be used?
I think there's an historical problem with policing and the crimes against women, in particular women who've been involved in certain occupations. They're treated as unworthy. I think that's a Europe-wide problem. I think the fact, however, that Interpol is doing something is an interesting contrast with what would be possible were any of these cases in the UK. I mean, Brexit has led to a gap between what the UK police can do and what Interpol does. We don't have access to the Schengen information system anymore, so it means that while this does look very negative, and I appreciate it's very dark, I suppose at least there is something happening there. And I do wonder whether in the UK that would be possible.
That's a very good point. Thanks, John. Now then, we'll move on, because the First Minister, Hamza Yusuf, has announced that projects to drive innovation in the production, storage and distribution of renewable hydrogen are to receive £7 million of Scottish Government funding. The Hydrogen Innovation Scheme was announced during an address to delegates at the All Energy Conference in Glasgow. This investment aims to support 32 projects, including a study into treating water from the River Clyde to produce hydrogen cheaply, the establishment of a green hydrogen production, learning, test and research hub in Stornoway, a scheme to use waste heat generated from wind turbines on the Isle of Lewis to create hydrogen, a hydrogen innovation hub at Glasgow Airport for storage and distribution, and a study examining the use of tidal energy around Yell in the Shetlands to produce hydrogen. The Council of the Western Isles, the Council of the Outer Hebrides, the University of the Highlands and Islands Outer Hebrides, and Plus Zero have been awarded £1.129 million for a green hydrogen production, learning, test and research hub at Creed Park in Stornoway. The First Minister said, "We have committed £100 million over this parliamentary session to supporting the green hydrogen sector. Part of that funding has been allocated to the Hydrogen Innovation Scheme, which supports feasibility studies, technical demonstrations, and testing facilities for new ideas about hydrogen." The head of municipal services at the Council for the Outer Hebrides, David MacLeod, said that they are delighted that the Creed Hydrogen Skills and Innovation Centre has been selected to receive funding. He added that this groundbreaking public, private, and university collaboration will help deliver the skilled workforce and robust hydrogen technology needed to support the Outer Hebrides' ambitions to be Scotland's leading green hydrogen production hub. So, John, firstly, the geographical spread of these projects caught my eye. They're spread from Yell to Stornoway to Aberdeen to Abbott's Inch. Do you think, is this a model of dispersed projects which should be used more in Scotland?
It does sound that way, and the contrast is clear, isn't it, with other forms of renewable? You're not dependent on tides or wind or whatever. You can generate hydrogen. I understand I'm no chemist, but I understand the experiment is something that can be done in schools. Actually, you can actually generate with a couple of electrical charges and some water and some other bits and pieces. I'm in danger of straying into areas I know nothing about here, but I gather it's a fairly simple thing, and so it could be done anywhere in Scotland. And there's the opportunity you've referred to there of using electricity production, which wouldn't be used because the demand wasn't there. One of the problems with renewable. So it does sound like a very positive image of what could be done in the future, and it's something we're hearing in Scotland, and we're not hearing so much of in the UK. Where I think there's been a wider failure to really push on this.
That's a very good point, John. Thank you. And I mentioned Stornoway there, and as I said, the Council, the University of the Highlands and Islands Outer Hebrides, and Plus Zero Limited have been awarded more than £1 million for a learning, test and research hub to be built at Creed Park in Stornoway. So do you think, is this sort of collaboration between the Scottish Government, councils, academia and private industry, is that a kind of model which we should be seeing more of an accelerating as we move through just transition and the decarbonisation of our economy?
I think it's the perfect example here of what could be done if we had full control over as they say, the levers of the economy. This is something you would borrow for. You would sensibly borrow huge amounts of money, plough them into that kind of activity, and reap enormous benefits. But there isn't the capability to do so, and the UK government is, as we've referred to earlier, UK government is obsessed with this notion that somehow nuclear power, hugely expensive, hugely unreliable, and likely to cost you millions when you have to finish it all. And so yes, but independence would seem like the obvious path towards being able to take advantage of that properly.
That's a very good point, John. I think I'm right in saying that in Germany, where all the nuclear power facilities have now been shut, the German government is still unable to accurately predict what the cost of demolishing and removing the nuclear power generation facilities in Germany is ultimately going to be. So the costs are completely unknown over the lifetime of these
Yeah.
projects.
We
But we'll
saw
move on.
recently in a sorry, can I just
Go on,
say
John.
something briefly at the end of that there?
Yes,
We saw recently
yes.
in a UK government document, we saw the prediction for how long they'll have to work on Dounreay as Dounreay is made safe. They're estimating at least 300 years. 300 years after it stops doing anything, 300 years of being looked after, monitored, money being spent. That gives you a rough idea. And I guess that even at the end of 300 years, there's still forms of radiation that have got hundreds of thousands of years life left in them.
That's a very good point, John. Thank you. We'll move on to our final item now, because a further £3.6 million has been allocated to the Hospital at Home to support more than 150 extra virtual beds. Hospital at Home aims to provide a safe, patient-centred alternative to an acute hospital admission. It provides a better outcome for the patient, who receives treatment in the safety and comfort of their own home, as well as reducing pressure on hospital sites. The investment for 2023-24, which will take the total funding in the service to more than £10.7 million since 2020, will increase patients managed through Hospital at Home by 50%, an additional 156 beds. Funding will be available to existing services and areas yet to develop the Hospital at Home programme, with improvement support provided by the Healthcare Improvement Scotland. Commenting, the Health Secretary, Michael Matheson MSP, said that patients have spoken very positively about this service, and it also reduces pressure on A&E and the Scottish Ambulance Service by avoiding admissions and accelerating discharge. Hospital beds will always be available to people who need them, but this is a better alternative for many. Belinda Robertson, the Associate Director of Improvement at Healthcare Improvement Scotland, said, "We're delighted the Scottish Government will continue to fund the development of hospital at home services. An increasing number of patients are experiencing the benefits of receiving acute hospital care at home." A recently published progress report by Healthcare Improvement Scotland showed a 68% in patients managed by the Hospital at Home service, 7,369 patients managed between April and November 2022, compared to 4,374 in the same period in the previous year. Hospital at Home currently has a virtual bed provision equivalent to the capacity of St John's Hospital in Livingston or the University Hospital in Ayr. So, John, you write widely on your blog at Talking Up Scotland too on Scotland's NHS. So, what's your immediate reaction to the expansion of the hospital at home services in Scotland's NHS?
Well, like all good ideas, you think, why weren't we doing this much earlier? But there's a kind of inbuilt sort of inertia in politics, isn't there? It always takes longer than you would hope for. So it's a great idea, and I'm very pleased that Scotland's kind of leading the way in this, because I'm not hearing the same kind of thing from other parts of the UK, although it is happening in other parts of the country. I think that the problem in the hospitals is being a bit overstated, and there's no, much written about the number of beds being occupied, but no attention to the statistics on the average number of days in which beds are occupied. And they've been falling quite dramatically. I mean, I saw some recent figures, I think from, I think it was from tail end of last year to the beginning of this year. The fall was about 25%, I think, fall in the number of days in which beds were occupied by people who really could be discharged. So I think that's worth keeping in mind. And I think we never hear also the comparative situation. There are almost 4 times as many population in England and Wales waiting for discharge from hospitals into care homes. So the situation is not as bad as it's being presented by the mainstream media. But I agree with the initiative. It's a tremendously sensible initiative, and I'm sure it works far better. I haven't read the research, but I'd imagine in terms of patient outcomes, it would seem obvious that it would work better. Hospitals can be very stressful places.
That's absolutely right, John. And I especially when I'm sitting here talking to you, I know that anecdote is not a synonym for data, but my own experience over the last 6 weeks is that both emergency care and acute medical beds in NHS and Lothian, Scotland's NHS and Lothian, is working very well. But I'm afraid that's all that we have time for this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs, and culture. Please help us to continue to make these programmes, to continue to develop the station, and to make new programmes for you. Our programmes will always be free to view, but if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We have set ourselves a target of raising £30,000 in order that we can continue to pay the bills. To everyone who has generously donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment as a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, thank you very much. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, either behind the scenes or in front of the cameras, or in any other way that helps our work, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can find us on Twitter at BroadcastScot. Please like and retweet us there. And you can also find us on Facebook by searching for Broadcasting Scotland. When you're watching us on YouTube, it would be great if you would like and subscribe to Broadcasting Scotland on that platform. We will be back tomorrow evening at 7 for the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please come back and join us then. I'd like to thank everyone who's been watching this evening, and of course, I'd like to give a very special thanks to our very special guest, Professor John W. Robertson. Thanks, John.
Thank you. Pleasure.
On this day in 1941, the Deputy German Führer Rudolf Hess parachuted into a field not far from Dungavel, apparently intending to meet the 14th Duke of Hamilton. I'm reminded that after his death in 1987, Spandau Jail, where he had been held in Berlin, was demolished, and a supermarket built on the site by the British Army to serve troops who were serving in Berlin. Officially, this was called the Britannia Centre. However, it soon became known as Hesco's. I hope that you have a very peaceful evening and don't go parachuting into South Lanarkshire. Bye-bye.